Awesome. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another week of ABC's A Contemporary Capital with David Harvey. I'll pass it over now. Just a quick note that we had originally put in the schedule that April 19th will be the last class. We'll actually be taking a break that week, and then we'll have two following classes that will both be live streamed. And for CUNY students, you know where to meet for that class. And yeah, with that, I'll pass it over to David for class today. Thanks.
Okay, well, welcome to this week's class, and we're doing masses in motion. Looking over it, I thought there were one of the things I really didn't mention, I think, enough is the mobilization of the mass as a source of power. And I should have maybe emphasized that a bit more strongly. And you know, when you command the mass, you can do a hell of a lot with it. And part of the struggle over centralization of capital and getting, you know, your hands on more and more of the mass and expanding the mass is because the more mass you have, the more power you have, and therefore you can actually use the mass to make more of the mass. And I thought I might just outline maybe an example I could have used and perhaps should have used, which is the example of George Soros and how George Soros got so wealthy, and what this has to do with the mass. And one of his famous moves was the day that he, as everybody said, he broke the Bank of England. Now, the context of this was that in the early 1990s, the European states all had their own currencies, but looking forward to a day when maybe the euro would come to be significant, they set up a exchange rate mechanism, the ERM, the exchange rate mechanism, in which all of the countries in the European Union agreed that they would maintain their relative exchange rates to each other within a very narrow bound. You know, I've forgotten what it was, maybe 3% or something like that. So, and the reason for this was that if there's going to be a lot of cross-border trade, you didn't want to be in a situation where you have wild swings in the value of the currency, and the Deutschmark would go this way and the franc would go this way somewhere else. So they were trying to make sure that there was a fairly stable currency system for the whole of Europe, even though it was made up of all the individual currencies of the different countries. And this seemed to work quite well, but in 1992, it became clear that the British pound was constantly trading at the lower bound of where it should be, and the sense came about that maybe the British pound was overvalued, and that there was likely to be some kind of devaluation of the British pound against all the other currencies. Now, the British didn't want that, and so they were protecting it. But along came George Soros, and he started to use all of his assets and buy pounds and then convert them into Deutschmarks. Now, the more he did that, of course, the more pressure there was, downward pressure there was on the pound, and more upward pressure on the Deutschmark. And after a bit, the British pound was really sort of wobbling on the edge of the lower bound. And at that point, George Soros started to borrow money like crazy. He went everywhere he possibly could, and he borrowed pounds everywhere. Masses and masses and masses of pounds, and he converted them into Deutschmarks, and this went on for about 2 or 3 days. And the way the British would protect the pound was actually to buy pounds. But in order to do that, they needed foreign exchange to do it. So they had to raid their foreign exchange reserves. And after about 3 days, it was 3 incredible days, the British had no exchange reserves left. And then they did the only other thing you can do, which is to raise the interest rate. The idea being here that if the interest rate in Britain was something like 16%, and I think it went up to something like that during this process, and the interest rate in Germany was say 8%, then you could, the Germans might want to buy pounds in order to get the higher rate of interest. That didn't work, and so the pressure on the pound became such that the pound in the end collapsed, and it had to be devalued. And as it was devalued, of course, then what George Soros did was then to take all the Deutschmarks, which he had got, and convert it back into British pounds. And of course, it was something like a 15% increase in the total with doing this. So he took all of his Deutschmarks and converted it back into pounds. He then paid off all of the bankers from whom he'd borrowed money and gave them a little bit of interest for lending it to him for, I don't know, 6 days or how many days it was. And then, of course, he was sitting there and he made something like $1 billion, the equivalent. Now, some people say he made $4 billion. The minimum was he made $1 billion. And now, for 1 week's work, $1 billion is a pretty good remuneration. But he got it because he had access to the mass. Now, I could have done that, but if I went to a bank and said, lend me $1 billion, or lend me £1 billion and I want to convert it into Deutschmarks, the bankers would look at me as if I was completely crazy. And it was only the fact that George Soros had something called the Quantum Fund, which had a certain kind of respectability and was, and the financial institutions could sort of bet on it. It had some kind of collateral behind it. But this is the point where I would make that George Soros increased his mass by using the mass to get more mass. And this is a familiar political thing in financial circles. So that the mass begets mass. And I think that the Soros incident in 1992, I think it was in September 1992, is a very, very good example of that. So the reason I wanted to have a sort of separate section on the mass right now is partly because, as I outlined at the beginning, we've got these problems of an increasing mass going on with everything from, climate change to plastic to the mass of credit, which is going on in the world, the mass of cement being consumed in China. So wherever you look around you, you see there's a rising mass going on. And you can say, okay, well, this is a bad thing and we need to do something about it, be some climate change or cement or whatever. But the point is that, generally speaking, what we have under capitalism is a rising mass of almost everything. And that mass is becoming increasingly problematic to manage. So, and it has certain implications there with the mass, that mass production means mass consumption, mass movement means that you're dealing with different levels of abstraction, all sorts of things like that. So there are all kinds of implications of this rising mass. And in the same way that many people analyze the falling rate, which is fine with me, just to analyze it as a falling rate, but you can also analyze the rising mass and start to say there are certain characteristics which you're looking at here. And this rising mass explains things like everything from globalization to many of the sort of problems we're having absorbing surplus capital this time. So there are many issues of that kind which crop up here, and I wanted to put those down. But I did want to emphasize the political power. The political power is dependent very much upon the mass. And we only, United States is only the most powerful country in the world because of the mass of capital that it commands and the massive value that it commands. And so therefore, that principle also applies to why centralization of capital is important. Somebody turned up a very interesting fact that Anwar Sheikh, a colleague of mine down in the New School, who's written a great deal about these things, did an empirical, just noted empirically that under conditions of the falling rate, the companies which do not go bankrupt are usually those which have a very large mass. And I give some examples of that, like Boeing is too big to fail, and a lot of companies at a certain point become so big they become too big to fail, and therefore they're going to be protected at any light. That the falling rate of profit for a small concern is more harmful, more likely to lead to bankruptcy than a falling rate of profit for a very large company. So that size and becomes great. And it was interesting to me when I was in China, I was talking to some people who were close to the financial things, and I was talking about, rates of profit, and they said, Chinese bankers don't care a hoot about the rate of profit. The first thing they ask you is what's your asset base? And whoever has the largest asset base is top dog. And they really don't care about the profit rate at all. It's simply care about the mass, which probably will explain why the 4 largest banks in the world are Chinese. By far, by the way, not just a little bit bigger than and the 5th largest bank is Japanese, and the 6th largest bank is JP Morgan. It's way down in terms of assets. It may have a lot of influence and power, but in terms of its mass, it's not anywhere near the mass of the 4 Chinese banks, which poses some very interesting problems if the United States starts to get into trying to sort of discipline China financially and do some of the things that it's been doing to Russia. So the mass, I think, question is a very important one. It needs to be looked at in its own right, but then I think it's important to situate it in relationship to the totality that we're looking at, and to ask questions about how does the totality absorb the rising mass of almost everything, and what does the story of the totality look like in the condition of this rising, ever rising mass. So those are some of the issues that I would probably want to add in. And one other issue I would add in towards the end, I sort of talk about the way in which the individual consciousness of a situation is radically different from that which would be required to perpetuate the class position. And that therefore there is a sort of a problem of the relationship between individual behaviors and individual possibilities and the mass movement. And that when you get to the mass movement, you start to have to look in a different kind of way. And this goes back to an idea that Engels has, which is Engels makes much of it. I don't particularly care for it in great detail, but it's relevant in this case, which is a sort of dialectical principle that small transformations of quantity at some point or other can bring about a qualitative shift in everything. The obvious example of this is water and ice. We can't walk on water, but we can walk on ice if it's thick enough. So the qualitative shift occurs in H2O when the temperature, so it remains with all the qualities of water up to a certain moment, and then it undergoes this shift into ice. And when it undergoes that shift into ice, it has different qualitative possibilities that we can walk on it. And I think that this is the sort of thing we start to find with mass relations, that individual behaviors add up in a certain way, and then they produce this kind of switch where the mass starts to have different qualities, and we start to, in a sense, walk on water because water has become ice. And we can start to do things, or certain things happen to a capitalist economy, not because of individual behaviors, but because it's gone through this switch into the sort of being ice-like. Certain things can happen at the macro level that cannot happen at the individual level, and this relationship is very important to Marx, and he deals with it in an interesting way. And as I mentioned at the end of the kind of thing, in political economy in general, there's this real problem of relationships between microeconomics and macroeconomics, and nobody knows how to put them together. Well, Marx kind of says, well, that's the nature of, the way you put them together is not by having some theoretical kind of adjustment. You look at the historical process. So this historical process is moving from individual capitalists acting in their own self-interest and maximizing their interest, producing a result which is actually antagonistic to the well-being of the capitalist class. And the capitalist class movement then starts to actually discipline individual capitalists, and therefore there is a relationship of this kind, which emerges in this chapter. So anyway, those are some of the odd things I would sort of add into into the paper, but you may have some things that you want to sort of talk further about. So why don't I throw it open and get you to kind of comment a little bit about what you might think of some of this. Anybody got anything they want to add?
Can I ask about, I think you mentioned about Chinese banks. You say that there are 4 largest banks and they're Chinese. I'm just wondering, what does it mean in contemporary situation? And do you know the dynamic of this within last decades?
Sorry, can you repeat that? What are you asking exactly? I missed out here somewhere.
I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more of what does it mean that today we have those like 4 Chinese banks as like the largest banks, and what was the dynamic like in previous time or decades?
Well, the interesting thing about banks in China is that they literally went out of business during the Cultural Revolution. They basically stopped functioning as banks during the Cultural Revolution. So in 1978, they were zero. And then, of course, you get the market process developing. And, markets do need banks to function effectively and well. And the old Chinese banks, which had existed there before the Cultural Revolution and still maintained this kind of shell presence during the Cultural Revolution, they obviously started to service this increasingly market economy. And I think that this is where the size thing came in. I mean, I have no idea why the bank managers all suddenly decided they wanted to compete with each other in terms of size, but they certainly did. And because they're very large, you see, some of the big banks in the United States, JP Morgan, for example, and it's mixed up with Chase now, but before it merged with Chase, JP Morgan was a very powerful bank, but it was mainly an investment bank. And there were 2 kinds of banks in the country. There were investment banks and retail banks. The retail banks handled, my salary coming in and my writing checks and having credit cards, all those kinds of things. The investment banks don't make their money out of retail activities. The investment banks make their money out of asset management, out of mergers and acquisitions. the volume of mergers and acquisitions is terribly important on Wall Street. And whenever there's a merger or an acquisition, the two companies merging want to know due diligence about what they're getting in the merger, and the banks are brought in to assess, what this company has and versus what that company has, and what the possibilities of the merger are. So the banks are experts in mergers and acquisitions, which, by the way, is of course all about the increasing centralization of capital. So J.P. Morgan, just by itself, is mainly about this kind of thing. So it's not concerned with its asset base in terms of the amount of retail activity that it's engaged in. Only recently, since 2008, have some of these things like Goldman Sachs and so on taken on retail banking functions in order to be protected by the certain bank legislation. So the banking structure in the United States and throughout Europe and so on is very different from the Chinese, because the Chinese do some of this merger and acquisition, but basically they're retail banks, and of course you just go out and get larger and larger and larger asset deposits, and then you start to do things like create shadow banking in what's called wealth management deposits and so on. So, yeah, I don't think that the Chinese banks have the same kind of power that, say, Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan have in the global economy, but they're massive retail operations. And therefore, the fact that China has so many billion of people is kind of means that you can get billions of deposits. Anyone else got something?
I've got a question.
Yeah.
So you have like these like 7 bullet point examples about the rising mass, and it seems like half of them are kind of about the like rising, like a larger mass of like monetary capital, and then the other half are like all related to fossil fuel stuff, whether it's like plastics or airline flights or cement. So like this kind of like rising mass is something that is specific to capitalism, whereas the fossil fuel stuff, that's more for like industrial capitalism, I suppose, right? So I guess I'm wondering, what's the next step? So if a lot of this environmental crisis related to capitalism is rooted in kind of the fossil fuel stuff, if it gets beyond this, I don't know, I just kind of, I don't know, maybe there's a half a thought there, but.
Well, I think the reason what I wanted to do with those initial examples was to say, a rising mass of value doesn't exist without there being some sort of parallel increase in use values. So the material conditions, like the use of cement or something of that kind, or flying airline miles or something, we're talking about use values and the physicality of it. The increase in value is not a physical thing in itself. For instance, the increase in the world money supply. It's not as if the Federal Reserve goes out there and sort of manufactures, sort of dollar bills. That's not what's going on here. When it engages in what we call quantitative easing, it's essentially adding to the global money supply by zeros, by just fiat, by just saying, okay, Federal Reserve, we're going to buy up, and since they can issue their own money, they just buy up a lot of surplus value and store it. and then they release it at a certain point when things are much better. So what I wanted to say was that the increase in value and the increase in exchange value is there, but that doesn't mean anything unless you can come up with something which is an increase in use value. So I wanted to sort of say, look, there's a physical material side to this increase, and that of course gets you close to things like the global warming, the cement case, the plastics case, and the like. So it was really about the material parallel to the expansion of value. And one of the things that's happening to the money in between is you're beginning to get an expansion of the money supply without necessarily expansion of the use values. And then you look at it and you kind of say, well, how can that be? And then you find actually the expansion of the money supply at some point or other has to come up with something which is going to match what it's the increase of value in terms of some use value, which becomes significant in the market. So that was the point of those two different approaches. Yeah.
Hi. I think, thank you. As I was reading this week's, like the aspects that I get particularly drawn to are the concepts that, when you talk about the abstraction and the totality and the contradictions, because I find these concepts useful that I then can apply once I better understand a concept like how a contradiction functions, I can apply that, other places. So I'm getting a lot out of the reading in that respect. And so I'm interested, like on page 12 of the reading, you talk, and it might be a quotation, I'm not sure, but where the growing accumulation of capital involves its growing concentration, and where the autonomy of the social conditions of production are asserted against the producers, the actual producers. And so it's interesting because there's the idea of capitalist relations as an ecosystem and as a sort of set of interrelated systems. But then you have this, like you said, like in terms of mass, the accumulation, and you have this. So there's clearly a kind of contradiction, or it seems as if that would be a contradiction. And I'm curious if, like, is this concentration, and it's sort of a silly question in a way, because trying to find a crisis or the crisis of capitalism is, it's a thing that people have, obviously spent a lot of time doing, but is the contradiction between this concentration of mass and the kind of like if the ecosystem idea is sort of basic to the structure of how capitalist relations actually work, maybe those two things are not commensurable ultimately. I mean, or is that just an obvious, am I reading you correctly, I guess?
Well, I don't think it's a question of reading me correctly. It's a question of somehow or other fine-tuning what we're doing and what we're saying, so that it can shed some light on exactly the sorts of problems you're looking at. I mean, that is not always easily done. In other words, I don't have a glib answer to all of this. But one of the things I think you need to look for here is that. And we're going to get onto this later on in sessions, is that when you kind of say, okay, it's an ecosystem which is in the process of becoming, it's changing and is dynamic and all the rest of it, but I'm not I'm not committed to saying the driving force here is always the same thing. And when Marx himself kind of says, well, why would a capitalist invest in technological change when that reduces the rate of profit. And if that was the case, you wouldn't do it, you know. But Marx's point is that the capitalists do it because they're seeking relative surplus value. And the falling rate of profit goes on, and Marx uses this phrase sometimes about goes on behind the back of the producers and comes and stabs them in the back, as it were. So the falling rate of profit stabs them in the back because they were pursuing relative surplus value and technological dynamism and rising productivity of labor. So that is a very powerful driving force in the system. But when you start to see something like, well, okay, there's a falling rate of profit, and then there are reactions which occur to that. Now, where do the reactions to the falling rate of profit come from? Some of it comes from individual producers who kind of say, well, basically, my mission here is not about the falling rate of profit, it's to increase the mass as much as I possibly can. And I don't care about the falling rate of profit too much, as long as I get more and more of the mass. And I think that may be what was going on inside of the Chinese banks, in which case the pursuit of relative surplus value doesn't play the same role as the pursuit of a rising mass. Because what George Soros is interested in is not the rate of profit. His rate of profit is beyond the wazoo. What Soros is interested in is getting more and more of the mass. And then you kind of say, well, when the mass is actually gives you the power to get more mass, then you're going to say, oh, well, I'm not interested in relative surplus value anymore. I'm just interested in the way in which the mass can be used to get more mass. And then that comes back to some of the things we're going to get to, or maybe we got here already, which is the way in which, for instance, big capital gobbles up the little capitalists. Now, why are they doing that? Because that increases the productivity of labor? Not necessarily. They're doing that because they just simply want to get the advantages of having the bigger mass. If I have a bigger mass than you, I can outbid you, outsqueeze you. I can, you know. So you move from a situation where the driving force is the theory of relative surplus value to a situation in which some of the time you're going to be seeing people using the mass to get more mass without bothering at all on the relative surplus value. Now, I'm not saying the relative surplus value disappears, but the ecosystem is itself being powered forward by, and when you start out, you're just saying it's powered forward all by the search for relative surplus value by individual capitalists. But we're now in a position to say, well, that is going on all the time, to be sure, but there is something else going on here, which is the mass being used to beget more mass, which is also very significant. And in some ways, you would say that actually, somebody wrote a book called The Cancer Stage of Capitalism, because it's like the mass starts to metastasize into the more mass. And it becomes a kind of rather cancerous growth structure. And at that point, you kind of say this doesn't look good as to where the global economy is going. So I think what we're looking at here, and which is why this kind of thing about the different distinction between individual capitalists and the way in which capital is constituted as social power, which disciplines individual capitalists in certain ways, and actually it becomes a power of getting more. So the spiral form, which we get to, can come out of individual capitalists, but this is a different way of getting the spiral form, which is size gives you the power to create more. So that's the way I would think of it, which may not be the right way to think of it, but this is the way I do. And I think later on when we get to things like what's going on with finance capital, and you see the George Soros example is saying, well, you don't need to be worried about relative surplus value and employing labor and doing all those kinds of things, you don't need that because, you can simply, if you're George Soros, you can simply go on and you can speculate in this kind of way and you can end up $1 billion richer of $7 7 days manipulation in the currency markets. And if you had a choice, then which capitalist would you rather be? Would you rather be George Soros and get it in 7 days, or would you rather be somebody who's really worrying about, how do you make steel and dealing with the workers and all this kind of stuff? But at a certain point, you kind of go, to hell with that. I'm going to go for the big stuff. And since 1980s, more and more people have done the George Soros type thing. And if they have done that, then that says the ecosystem is itself being transformed by this rising power, this rather, I would tend to regard it as a sort of cancerous force of finance capital, which is there. That may be a wrong way to look at it, but see what I mean? So, and this again is something interesting about reading Marx, is that if you're just reading about the theory of relative surplus value, you think that's all there is. And you think this is crucial and it's significant and it's important, and rightly so. But if you stay on that and say that's all that matters and all this other stuff is peripheral, I think you're missing out on something which is what Marx is saying. And when that the autonomy of the social conditions, and it is a quote from Marx about the power of capital grows. In other words, the autonomy of the social conditions of production, as personified by the capitalist, is asserted more and more as against the actual producers. Capital shows itself more and more to be a social power, with the capitalist as its functionary. Now, the capitalists at one time or other drove capital. Now, capitalism is driving the functionary, a power that no longer stands in any kind of relationship to what the work of one particular individual can create. It is instead an alienated social power, which has gained an autonomous position and confronts society as a thing, and as the power the capitalist has through this thing. So Marx is saying, you've got to watch out here because there's something going on. We're moving from a world of water. We're going to start walking on the ice, as it were. And when we walk on the ice, we're in a different world. So Marx is there's a continuous unfolding, if you like, in Marx. And I actually like this a lot, but some people kind of find it terribly confusing, and I don't mind that it's confusing, but I think the unfolding and the becoming is very, very significant. Now, how are there? But he never finished the process, of course. So he's telling you, okay, we're moving on to ice, but he doesn't tell you what the ice is like and what it's like to skate around on it. He doesn't do that, and we have to do that. But I think the method is really interesting for me, anyway. I mean, I this is why I find myself fascinated by sort of always going back to Marx's texts and seeing how he's unfolding things.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Michelle?
I guess what I was reading, well, two things. I think the example that the example I was thinking of when you were talking about this mass, getting more mass is kind of in the technology sector. I think that's an easy example to think of, the Netflix example that you gave, that the number of users is more important necessarily than their profit value. And I was just thinking about that because of course the data that can be gleaned from these users is more valuable and can create more value for the company. So anyway, that was just I think a helpful example there to think about how mass can create more mass. And then I guess when I was reading my comment on on some of the other examples, and something I'm still trying to work out a little bit is the examples you gave of the consumer culture for durables was one, consumer durables, and then another was, as Chris mentioned, the kind of lifestyle and experiential consumer products, if you will, that there's a lot of demand for now. And I was curious how some of the social reproduction types of products fit in, whether they're services or actual products. But it seems to me like those things, like whether they're cell phones or laundry services or anything that kind of helps the professional worker in a capital, in a capital, I don't, what's the word, the investment country, or a capital intensive country, sorry. Yeah, so I was kind of wondering how do you see that fitting into the bigger picture? Because to me, it seems like there's sort of this double use for capital, that there's a use value and the demand that gets created. And then of course that creates more profit for the capitalist as well, in the sort of professional worker trying to reproduce themselves.
Yeah, well, I mean, the whole structure of, I mean, all I really wanted to do there was to say, look, consumerism and wants, needs, and desires, which lie behind the consumer culture, if you like. The capital can never leave them alone. They have to be restructured, because the only way you can expand the market is by coming up with new wants, needs, and desires. And how do you do that? How do you persuade everybody? But it turns out it's fairly easy. And one of the things that is very clever about technological change, I mean, Steve Jobs, for example, was an absolutely lousy producer. He didn't know how to produce things. He really didn't. But in terms of the kind of product that is going to absolutely be, going to saturate the whole world within a few years, he was a genius at coming up with products which were going to somehow or other match wants, needs, and desires. In other words, it's not as if somebody knows exactly what those wants, needs, and desires are, but he sensed it, and his products were incredible in the sense that they really worked. And of course those products were incredible at the mass base. And while they're very significant for productive activity and professional activity and all the rest of it, they're also very, very important for just pure consumption purposes. So that the whole kind of question of coming up with commodities which people are going to want, need, and desire, and so much want, need, and desire that they become instantaneously, globally, as it were, a radical transformation in consumer culture, which then raises the question of what's the next step, and what is going to happen. down the line, and where are the new wants, needs, and desires coming from? And I find, you know, for example, if you want a sort of a microcosm of what capitalism is about these days, you would look at the economy of a cruise liner. I mean, it's fabulous. To begin with, you have something like 3,000 people, all in search of an experience. You have about 2,000 people looking after them. So there's the labor kind of question. You have fixed capital and sophistication. The cruise liner works in part by having a shopping mall inside of it, so that people can go buy things. It also has restaurants. It also has bars, you know, and the cruise liner doesn't run any of those. They subcontract to, you know, different people to come in and set up a bar and set up a restaurant, and a name brand chef will be responsible for this restaurant and that restaurant and so on. I mean, you could kind of look at the cruise liner and you say, well, what is this about? And a tremendous amount of energy is consumed, you know, and you kind of look at it and you kind of say, well, this is a bit like, you know, in a sense, the whole of the planet has become like one vast cruise liner. I'm exaggerating, but this I think, and this is a dynamic situation. I mean, cruise liners did not exist before. I don't know when the first cruise liner was set up. Probably, my guess would be about 1990. So they've been around, maybe 20 years, something like that. But until the pandemic came along, cruise liners were kind of everything. Then of course they've been blocked, and now, you know, what's happening in the cruise line industry is very interesting rationalization going on. I think Richard Branson has sort of bought out a whole bunch of cruise liners, so that is imagining that somehow or other this is going to be the future of experiential capitalism. So this is a kind of fascinating thing, and then also you have to learn the trick of monetizing things. This is where, you know, spectacle can get monetized through television and through you know, the thing that's infuriating me these days is the number of platforms you now see ranged on your television screen. You know, when you want to get something, you go, you know, there used to be about 4 platforms, and now there's about 30 or 40, and you don't know which one is the one that's going to carry whatever you want to see. You know, so it's kind of become a bit crazy that way. So this is a very interesting kind of thing. And again, what I'm trying to do here is to mention these sorts of things, and without necessarily kind of going into all of the details. So that, you know, somebody can write some fascinating dissertations, I think, to be written about cruise liners. The economics of a cruise liner is kind of really fascinating. Anyway, sorry, I wandered all over the place in response to.
Actually, while I was listening, I realized I had a kind of a practical question about the Netflix example. I'm not very familiar with finance and how finance works. And so I was curious, who or how does it get decided that the number of users makes Netflix more valuable than their profit? I was curious about that specific.
The advertisers.
How or why?
The advertisers. Just simply that. I think if Netflix, just reading the financial press, Netflix has been in a little bit of downswing over the last couple of months, not because of its profit rate, but because it's and not because it has fewer subscribers, but because its rate of expansion of subscribers has sort of tailed off a bit. And then you're talking about, well, if a Netflix product can get say 1 million viewers or something like that over 2 months or something of that kind, then the advertisers will pay more to put their ads on that, as opposed to somewhere else. So it's the advertising thing that I think is the commercial thing. The Netflix, again, I was reading something about, by the way, the employment conditions of people working on Netflix products. And these employment conditions are appalling. And then there have been some strikes actually out in California over, the kind of thing, people are supposed to be on the set at 6 in the morning and can't leave till 9 at night, and they, the rate of exploitation is really. And of course, the weird thing is, everybody seems to think that somehow or other this is all. It's not labor intensive, but actually Netflix is pretty labor intensive, and a cruise ship turns out to be rather labor intensive. So it belongs to the labor intensive, value producing kind of realm. Any other kind of comments you want to make, or others people want to make?
I just want to chime in on this Netflix example, but I know it's been in the news recently that they're going to start charging people for sharing passwords. Like my mom and I share my password with my family, and they're going to start charging for that now. So this is kind of a new dynamic on their business model.
Yeah. Yeah. No. I mean, every it's a bit like speeding on the highway. You come up with a thing that tells you there's somebody with a radar gun down the road, and then they come up with something that disables that. So there's a lot of things going on in this realm. It's very dynamic. I mean, I mean, when it first started coming on, I loved to go and watch some of these old movies on what was called the Criterion collection, and that was great. And then that disappeared, and then you find that certain films disappear, and you never know where to find them. And I don't know. It's kind of I don't know whether everybody here is okay with it, but I must say I find myself more and more frustrated. The other thing that is very annoying is I confess I'm a bit of a soccer fan, so I like to watch the soccer. And the soccer has moved off the main lines to somewhere called Peacock, and then the other soccer is disappeared somewhere else. And I was searching for it, and the next thing I know, as I actually see on my credit card that I have managed to have signed up for about 4 different. So it's $9 a month for about 4 different platforms, which and the thing that's interesting is how easy it is to sign on to a platform by mistake, and how hard it is to get out of a platform. So everything is sort of.
Do you think there might be, like, in a very circular way, we might just go back to cable because we are so frustrated with all of these streaming sites, and purchasing subscriptions to each of them ends up being more than like what we were paying when we had like Comcast on demand, and it's just it feels ridiculous to be paying $10 to $20 per streaming service.
Yeah,
we could just go back to those packages.
No, I mean, but how
back to piracy.
how will that happen? How can you make that happen when actually those who are organizing the whole kind of streaming structures and the platforms and so on are essentially there? I mean, we have a lot of consumer choice of which show we watch, but we don't have any consumer choice over the number of platforms we have to engage with. I mean, this is again. It seems to me that some of the stuff that's going on is around this creating mass kind of process. I mean, I would like it to become simpler, but I just don't want them to eliminate my capacity to watch the soccer matches I want to watch. So it's always that sort of thing. I wrote a utopian sketch at the end of a book I did in 1999 on Spaces of Hope. And one of the things that I said in there was, this is before all this happened, I said that, I imagined one day that there will be one centralized kind of place where you could go and get anything you wanted in the way of music and culture and all the rest of it. In other words, I imagined a world, and it was, of course, all free. And that everybody would have equal access to the whole of the history, world, culture, and all the rest of it. So this is part of the utopian kind of imagination. Well, in a funny kind of way, it's happened, except you now have to pay for it, and it's kind of and I like some of it. I mean, I like the fact that I can get any kind of music I want with an Alexa program or whatever. It's remarkable, I want to listen to symphonies, I want to listen to jazz, I want to listen to this. It's all there. I mean, this is fantastic. But then, how much do you pay for it? And by the way, how long will it remain in the condition it's in right now, which is reasonably accessible and general, or will it start to be that you have to start splitting it up and say, well, if you want classical music, you'll have to use this genre. If you want jazz, you want that. You want pop, you want that. So it soon be divided up into different areas, and with lots of ghastly advertisements in the middle. And how long is it going to last? I mean, my fear is that the system will work for a little while, and then something like this will come in and they'll monetize it in a different way. So experiential consumerism is not is great in some ways, but negative in others. And if capital can take it in an even more negative direction, it will. Any other kind of comments? Because if not, I'm going to go into the lecture, session 8. Are you prepared? And the topic is on fixed capital and the consumption fund. And it relates back a bit to what we've been talking about. I mean, the cruise liner is a classic case of fixed capital, but it's also part of a consumption fund. We'll get into that as we go forward. All right, classical political economy treated the distinction between fixed and circulating capital as a primary problem. Marx, on the other hand, found the distinction between constant and variable capital far more useful. It revealed the true nature of capital by highlighting the class relation that anchored everything else. Conceptualizing capital accumulation in terms of fixed and circulating capital neatly concealed consideration of the class relation. It vanishes in that language. Nevertheless, Marx also paid considerable attention to fixed capital. In the Grundrisse, he depicted its distinctive form of circulation as one of the three major circulatory processes operating within the totality of capital. The other two were, of course, the circulation of capital in general and also the circulation of labor capacity. Now, when approaching this question of fixed capital, it's important at the outset to set up some distinctions so as to avoid confusion. Fixed capital within the enterprise comprises plant, machinery, and equipment, all of which have to be purchased in the marketplace as commodities. The primary use value of this fixed capital is to increase the productivity of labor, and it is this, of course, which results in the tendency for the profit rate to fall. There are, however, two features of the employment of fixed capital that make its circulatory process somewhat peculiar, and I quote Marx. He's always talking about the peculiar nature of its circulation. Firstly, as a means of production, it does not contribute any material substantive input into whatever is produced. It has this quality in common with some other forms of constant capital, such as energy inputs. The commodity produced does not physically incorporate pieces of the machine or units of energy. The transfer of the value of such forms of constant capital into the final product is therefore a matter of social calculation rather than physical material measurement, even though the physical properties of the fixed capital, its durability and lifetime, for example, have an important role to play in its circulation. The second feature, and this distinguishes machinery from the energy that drives it, is that fixed capital is deployed over many cycles of production and often for many years. The distinction between circulating and fixed capital rests, therefore, on some conception of a normal turnover time, which is, if it is greatly exceeded, differentiates fixed from circulating capital. The normal turnover time of circulating capital is also a social rather than purely physical determination. Marx put it on a yearly basis, which made some sense given the general turnover time for the production of agricultural commodities in the temperate regions. Marx recognized, of course, that some production processes might entail several turnover times in a year, and that the coercive laws of competition would incentivize the shortening of both production time and circulation time within the average turnover time of capital. So while Marx based his analysis on the assumption of a standardized and normalized turnover time, actual turnover times were likely to be variable and very much in flux. And furthermore, something like cotton spinning presumes, however, production on a continuous basis, which only can be measured as volume of output per hour. The history of capital suggests, however, a tendency towards the systematic reduction of turnover times, or from the other perspective, speed up of all turnover times. Speed up in the realm of circulating capital, stimulated by the coercive laws of competition, sometimes appears just as important in the historical dynamics of capital accumulation as a tendency towards the falling rate and rising mass of profit. Marx approaches the study of fixed capital step by step. He begins by observing that if capital is for some reason, either technical or social, stuck or, the language he used is this, fixated in the form of commodities yet to be sold or money yet to be invested, then a certain loss of value, devaluation, occurs. Hence the hustle and bustle involved in keeping as much capital as possible in motion, along with speeding up that motion as much as possible. The problem of fixation and devaluation becomes more pressing in the context of the differential turnover times required for different capitals. A cotton factory requires a certain amount of raw cotton on a daily basis, while the cotton crop comes in once a year. Someone has to store the cotton and guard its potential value after the harvest in such a way as to release it to the factories when it is needed. Some degree of physical fixation and lack of motion, and hence loss of value, is unavoidable, and strenuous efforts are made to reduce the downtime of capital's motion and to minimize any loss of value due to fixation. Interestingly, Marx identified the kinds of steps that would ultimately lead to the Japanese just-in-time production system of the 1980s, in which inventories are reduced to a minimum by the optimal scheduling of inputs from intermediate suppliers. If the continuity cannot be achieved physically, then financial means can be found via the credit system to ensure a smooth flow of money between the cotton growers, the merchants, and the cotton spinners to enable them to meet their daily costs. The credit system and the circulation of interest-bearing capital enter upon the scene, not as parasites, as is sometimes supposed, but as creative and necessary helpmates to assure the continuity of money flows in the face of radical differences in physical turnover times. Marx abstracts from all of these complications to recognize fixed capital as that part of the constant capital that remains in productive use over many turnover times and over many years. It takes time, however, for the circulation of fixed capital to harden, and that's Marx's expression, into a distinctive form of circulation governed by its own laws of motion. The immediate problem posed is how does the value embodied in the machine return into the general circulation of capital through its use in production? The easiest answer is to assume what's called straight line depreciation. A machine that is purchased for $10,000 and which has a physical lifetime of 10 years should return the equivalent of $1,000 of its value per year by way of the commodities it helps to produce. The value returned can then be used at the end of 10 years to buy another machine for $10,000. This is the simplest and least problematic form of fixed capital circulation. But matters are in practice much more complicated. To begin with, the physical lifetime of the machine is not easily determined. Variable lifetimes of particular machines can be compacted down to average lifetimes of, for example, all power looms everywhere. Some capitalists would then be advantaged because their machines last longer than the social average, while others would lose out because their machines stop working after 5 years. In any case, the capitalist has to save, accumulate, the annual return of 1,000 as an increasing amount of savings, and this is dormant capital, to be able to buy the new machine after 10 years. This involves the fixation of a lot of money capital over the lifetime of the machine. But then we have to consider what happens when new, more, and/or cheaper machines come on the market before the straight line depreciation schedule is complete. Competition would then ensure that the old machines are devalued before their physical lifetime is out. A gap arises between the physical and the economic lifetime of the machine. Anxiety on this point leads capital to seek to recuperate the value of its fixed capital as quickly as possible. Hence the incentive to 24-hour use and the imposition of shift work on the labor force. This was the sort of thing that happened in the Manchester industrialism with which Marx was so familiar. The difference between recuperating the value of a machine in 5 years instead of 10 is economically significant. The more technology becomes a business and the faster the progress of technological change, the more the problem of what Marx rather quaintly calls moral depreciation affects matters. Instead of straight line depreciation, the value of machinery is here calculated in terms of replacement cost in the then and there, which tends to fall over time, sometimes precipitously. The general effect is periodic devaluations of existing fixated capital due to the advent of cheaper and more efficient machines. One answer to this problem is, of course, to lease the machinery and equipment, where possible, on a periodic, for example, annual basis, which allows for renegotiation of the lease to reflect the availability of new and more efficient machines. This is what people do with photocopiers, for example, and airlines, for example, lease rather than own most of their aircraft. There is a third option, in which machines are valued by way of their contribution to the commodity values which they help to produce and realize in the market. In other words, the value of the input is determined by the value of the output. This method poses a huge problem for bourgeois economic theory, which likes to presume, for purposes of its perfected model, that the value of the capital stock, value of the machines, is fixed and independent of the prices of commodities produced and realized in the market with the aid of this stock. When capital takes the form of money, there is no problem of valuing capital inputs. When it takes the form of a physical stock, e.g. working machines, then putting a money value on them is problematic, because that value is typically not independent of the commodity values it helps produce. In 2007-2008, when the housing market collapsed, the banks had a huge inventory of foreclosed properties on their books, which in the absence of a viable market had no market value whatsoever. For accounting purposes, however, there had to be assigned some arbitrary value which reduced valuations to guesswork. Bourgeois economics here collapses into tautologies of the sort that Marx describes so critically in his introduction to the Grundrisse. In the 1960s, this led to a so-called capital controversy, an intense technical argument about how to value fixed physical capital stock without reference to what it is used to produce. This problem has not been satisfactorily resolved in conventional economics. But as Marx noted, when bourgeois economics confronts a seemingly irresolvable contradiction, its only answer is to pretend it does not exist. So no one mentions the capital controversy anymore. Its potentially troubling implication that all bourgeois models of the economy are founded on tautologies are studiously ignored. What appear as tautologies in bourgeois economics appear as contradictions in Marx's theory. And Marx, of course, embraces such contradictions. The bourgeois policymakers' answer to the problems of 2008 was to flood the world with excess liquidity so as to rescue the banks in the hope that this would trickle down and revive the housing market, as well as the economy in general. It turns out that most of that flood of liquidity ended up, predictably in Marxian theory, in the pockets of a ruling kleptocratic oligarchy. What actually happened in housing markets will be taken up later. Marx sees the circulation of fixed capital as a special case of the contradictory unity between production and realization. To begin with, fixed capital is defined by its use, rather than by its material physical qualities. There are a lot of sewing machines in the world, but they only constitute fixed capital when assembled by a capitalist entrepreneur in a sweatshop employing wage labor. The sewing machine that used to be in every working class grandmother's parlor is not fixed capital. This distinction is important. It implies that fixed capital can be augmented or diminished by changing the uses of existing things. It is frequently held that the transition to full-fledged capitalist economic development rests on a prior surge of investment in fixed capital formation. The historical data tend to support this, except for the first takeoff into self-sustaining capitalist development in Britain after 1700 or so. In that case, there is no evidence at all for any surge of fixed capital formation prior to the Industrial Revolution. It seems that merchant capitalist robbery of much of the world of value from the 17th century on led to the use of that value in Britain to support consumption and state functions through the creation of assets that could later become fixed capital through change of use. The flexibility of definition of fixed capital is essential to Marx, but anathema to bourgeois economics because it cannot put a stable value on K, which is the symbol for capital, the capital input to all of its modeling equations. Now, at this point, however, it is necessary to broaden the concept of fixed capital beyond the machines employed in production. Marx takes up the case of fixed capital of an independent kind and differentiates between that part that is embedded in the land and that part that is movable. Marx mainly gestures towards the importance of these distinctions without exploring them in the detail they deserve. While the use value of such investments may be somehow contribute, albeit indirectly, to the productivity of labor, the contribution is not always clear or measurable, as it is in the case of machines. While the interstate highway system in the United States clearly contributed to overall productivity of the economy, there are plenty of bridges to nowhere whose contribution is at best dubious. To better understand how such investments work, consider the transport industry, which in Marx's view produces value and surplus value by producing change of location for both people and commodities. The fixed capital of an independent kind, embedded in the land, consists of the highways and railways, the ports, harbors and stations, the cranes and loading equipment, the warehouses and retail establishments, and so on. There is an immense amount of it. The fixed capital not embedded in the land is comprised by the engines and rolling stock, the trucks, cars, scooters and bicycles, the container ships, barges, ferries and boats, the aircraft, and so on. All of this taken together constitutes the fixed capital of the transport system. It is a far from trivial mass of capital involved, but much of this physical stock is also used for purposes of consumption. Many, if not most of these physical items partially belong to what Marx calls the consumption fund. Important to define this. And it is defined as long-term assets created in support of daily consumption. The biggest owned items in the consumption fund are housing and cars. But as earlier noted, consumer durables also constitute a major market. State provision of healthcare and education, along with many other physical and social infrastructures, also characterize the full panoply of items that constitute the consumption fund. Here too, changes of use take material items from one economic category to another. When an abandoned cotton mill is converted into a residential condominium or recreation center, then this amounts to a transfer from fixed capital to the consumption fund. When the granting of microcredit to a peasant family leads into production for profit, then the peasant hut moves from being part of the consumption fund to being a form of fixed capital. There is also a problem of joint uses. A road, I quote Marx, can be used to transport commodities or for taking walks. Cars and houses can be used for production, work, or for pleasure. The question is then posed as to who builds the road and how may its value be recuperated through use and what kind of use. While the uses may be individualized, it is the collective consumption that in many instances matters. Toll roads and bridges are used by millions of drivers, and their economic viability depends on monetizing individual uses for collective benefit. While it may be possible to impose user charges, toll roads and bridges, airport taxes, user licenses, congestion charges, and the like, it is often impossible to assign costs and revenues to such investments in an economically equitable or rational way. Responsibility for building much of this infrastructure, therefore, lies as much in the public or state domain as it does in the domain of capital itself. But Marx does suggest, in his lengthy disquisition in the Grundrisse on who is going to build the road, that one measure of the maturity of capital is the degree to which such activities as road building migrate from the state sector into that of private capital. Urban infrastructures, however, are even more complex commodities, comprising many elements juxtaposed in such a way as to be presumably as usable as possible, though for whom and for what is not always clear. It is here, too, that the collective forms of both production and consumption play a significant role. All of this exists at another level of complexity. But that level, as we shall later see, rests on a solid understanding of the simple version of how capital circulates through fixed capital and consumption fund formation. Consider again the basic rules of fixed capital circulation and consumption fund formation. If a capitalist buys a machine for $10,000 in the expectation that the machine will enhance the productivity of labor power over a 10-year lifetime, then this ties up a large amount of capital in a technically devalued because fixated state for 9 years, while 1,000 of the value is considered used up in the first year in the production of surplus value in commodity form. The remaining 9,000 fixed capital stands idle and unused, devalued and fixated until the following year. Technically, unused capital is devalued, dead capital. In this instance, its value will be resuscitated over the 10 years of its employment. This circulation entails a long waiting time. The risk of moral depreciation from coming on the line of new machines and cheaper machines of the dead capital typically increases over time. Long-term investments in fixed capital and consumption fund seemingly go against the main tendency of capital, which is to accelerate turnover times, speed up production and consumption, and to maximize surplus value production in the here and now. Fixed capital and consumption fund formation entail a slowing down of circulation, while circulating capital is typically about speeding up. It seems like a part of the capital circulation slows down in order to facilitate speeding up the circulation of the rest. Investments in fixed capital and the consumption fund will therefore only occur in situations in which society is prepared to defer benefits now to reap the benefits of rising productivity later. This presumes that society can afford to wait to reap the benefits of rising productivity later. The benefits of long-term capital investments then should be sufficiently well known and acceptable to feed the pursuit of rising labor productivity and mass consumption through fixed capital and consumption fund formation. At this point, however, we encounter a strange concordance of effects and interests. The law of falling rate and rising mass tends to produce, as we earlier saw, crises of idle surpluses of capital and surpluses of labor power side by side. We dealt with that in the last session. Investment in machinery, fixed capital, requires surpluses of both capital and labor to be held back from current consumption in order to increase future output. In the early stages of capitalism, such deferred gratification imposed considerable stress on populations living on very little. Society had to tighten its belt and be prepared to wait in order to mobilize the necessary surpluses of capital and labor power required to invest in fixed capital and reap the benefits of rising labor productivity. Once the fixed capital comes online, however, the mass of commodities on the market increases, while labor is released from production through the mechanism of the falling rate of profit. This is the point at which the circulation of fixed capital hardens into a separate circulatory process. Machine technology, moreover, transforms the category of labor input from individual to the sociality of the laboring mass, such as within the factory. So-called productive labor, productive surplus value, can no longer be assessed from what an individual does, because it is the organization of collective labor in the factory that now matters. Fixed capital comes into its own under conditions of mass production and mass consumption. The rising mass of ever cheaper final product necessitates an expanding market for use values through the formation of the world market, as we've seen, while rising productivity creates ever greater surpluses of use values of both commodities and labor. Fixed capital, in short, helps to produce the surpluses of circulating capital and labor power that are required to facilitate even more fixed capital investment. This seemingly closed loop propels, in the absence of any countervailing force, a steep downward spiral in the profit rate. But there are moments in the movement of capital which delay this movement, other than by crises, such as, for example, the constant devaluation of a part of the existing capital. The transformation, I'm quoting now, a constant devaluation of part of the existing capital, the transformation of a great part of capital into fixed capital that does not serve as agency of direct production, unproductive waste of a great portion of capital. This is an explosive idea. Marx does not elaborate on it, but we can. To begin with, the constant current of devaluation has a permanent presence in the basement, as it were, of capital accumulation. Crises arise when that current, for some reason, becomes a flood, in which the physical destruction, the monetized depreciation, and the devaluation of the assets, the skills, as well as the commodities, along with the labor forces, all collide to produce stasis within the capitalist economy. When value loses its motion, then capital is dissolved. The second possibility is a diversion of fixed capital investment into non-surplus value producing projects, and surplus capital flows into consumption fund formation for which there is no clear market demand. A new opera house that is never used, for example. The use value of fixed capital shifts from promoting the increasing productivity of labor in production to absorbing the mass of surplus product and surplus labor through investments in fixed capital of an independent kind, along with the formation of a continuously rising consumption fund that may or may not have any users. The seemingly bizarre idea of using this form of fixed capital and consumption fund formation to absorb the ever-increasing mass of surplus value and surplus labor produced by the falling rate of profit is largely ignored in the literature. It is therefore helpful to expand on it here. Fixed capital formation, particularly that of an independent kind, becomes a sink for absorbing surplus capital and labor, rather than a means for increasing the productivity of labor. Like planned obsolescence, it constitutes a means to manage the crisis tendencies of capital by way of preempted but organized devaluations of portions of the rising mass. The only parallel to this possibility in Marx's writing, in his view, is that spending money on military equipment and warlike ventures amounts to dumping value in the ocean, and we're seeing a lot of that happening right now. But notice, in his language, he said it is the great part and the great portion of capital that is involved in these non-productive but capital-absorbing activities. If this argument is correct, then we might anticipate that the management of the crisis tendencies of capital since, say, 1945 should focus on the economic role of military expenditures and of managed devaluations in the field of fixed capital investment and consumption fund formation. These have possibly been the dominant ways to dispose of or absorb unlimited surpluses without suffering major crises of chaotic and unpredictable devaluation. Long-term investments in the built environment, for both production and consumption, are well positioned to absorb surplus capital and surplus labor, and are frequently undertaken for exactly this purpose. Consider, for example, Roosevelt's creation of the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, in 1935. This is a classic case of the conscious use of such a strategy. Idle capital and labor were put to work by the state using deficit financing on infrastructure building projects in a desperate attempt to revive capital accumulation. The aim was to absorb as much surplus capital and as much surplus labor as possible without any consideration whatsoever of how productive such investments might be. Mussolini's investments in the Mezzogiorno, Hitler's building of the Autobahn, Eisenhower's building of the interstate highway system in the 1950s, China's huge urbanization and infrastructure projects of 2008, 2009, and onwards, and Biden's recent infrastructure plans of 2021 are all moves of this sort. Some of these investments may have turned out to be productive in the long run, but at that time, this was not their point. Even if they turned out productive, the impact was so far into the future as to have little relevance for the present. The motivation is to put surplus capital and labor to work, no matter what, in order to facilitate the reproduction of capital. The spectacular urbanization projects of contemporary capitalism, particularly of China, are very much of this sort. Something that was marginal in Marx's time has become foundational for ours. The international difficulties of 2007 and 2008, for example, around the finance of housing and other aspects of consumption fund formation in the built environment, primarily in the United States, but also in Spain, Ireland, and a host of other countries, was a real problem. The general crisis was largely resolved, ironically, in large part by a massive surge of investment into fixed capital and consumption fund formation in China, the productivity of which is moot. About 30% of China's GDP was caught up in fixed capital and consumption fund formation, 15% in housing construction alone after 2008. Whole new cities were built that for a while stood bereft of any inhabitants. More than 20,000 miles of high-speed train network were built in a few years. No wonder the Chinese consumed so much cement. Remember the cement case. This was mainly what stopped the global economy plunging into a 1930s type depression in the wake of the financial collapse of 2007 and 8. In Marx's time, the image conjured up of fixed capital was that of the machine in the factory. It now incorporates that of the Shanghai or Dubai skylines. It surpasses all imagination to think that the thoroughly wasteful investment in Hudson Yards in New York City, the largest real estate development in the United States has ever seen, has anything to do with increasing labor productivity. A new tunnel under the Hudson River would be something entirely different. Hudson Yards stands, instead, as a monument to the need to create a countervailing force to the falling rate of profit through the absorption of as much of the rising mass of surplus capital and labor as possible in the production of mindless and wasteful urbanization. Unproductive or wasteful fixed capital and consumption fund formation has become, over time, a significant feature in the dynamics of accumulation. During the halcyon days of the property boom in Spain after 2000, for example, a whole new city, Ciudad Real, was built to the south of Madrid, replete with a huge new airport costing some 2 or 3 billion euros. It was built with the fantasy that a significant overflow from the congested airport in Madrid would materialize. And then came the crash of 2007 to 8, which hit Spain and its property sector in particular very hard. The initiating company of the airport went bankrupt, and the completed airport was put up for auction. A Chinese company bid something like 50,000 euros. The bid, of course, was refused. The airport was finally bought out by a private investor for an undisclosed but presumably trivial sum, but it has never attracted commercial passenger flights. It finally found a use by offering storage space for all the surplus planes that were put out of service during the COVID-19 pandemic. But in this case, maybe something here, the value of the fixed capital appeared to be lost, but the construction companies, developers, and raw material suppliers produced a great deal of surplus value profit from their contracts to construct the airport, even though the project ultimately went bankrupt. In a way, the bankruptcy did not really matter. Its economic purpose was served by creating demand for construction, raw materials, wages for workers, who then became consumers, furnishings and technical equipment for loading and unloading and the like. The aggregate circulation of the mass of capital was less affected by the bankruptcy of the airport than would otherwise have been the case. Investments of this sort often go belly up, but Marx also noted the first wave of investors in situations of this sort often go bankrupt, leaving behind use values that can get bought up at a fire sale prices to then be put to profitable use. A large portion of the constant capital required for the running of the airport has to be paid up front in the form of fixed capital and a consumption fund, most of which is embedded in the land. This poses the question of how to value all of this in relation to its use and the income stream it might generate. The only sensible way to do this is to take the third option for valuation, in which the airport is valued by way of the income it generates. The income stream, once it materializes through use, can be capitalized as a form of what Marx calls fictitious capital. Investors may invest in the shares of the airport company in return for a payment which Marx argues means that investments of this kind circulate in return for interest, which is only a part of the surplus generated. The owners of the airport do not produce anything. They simply charge a fee for its use. This is, however, a matter to which we will return. The relation between circulating capital and fixed capital and consumption fund formation needs more explicit attention. Machinery is part of circulating capital when it is being produced, and only becomes fixed capital when it is in the hands of the users in the factory or in the airport. The realization of the values locked up in the fixed capital and in the consumption fund depends on their valorization through continuous, and consistent use over several years. Any deviation from this requirement will result in devaluation of the fixed capital and consumption fund assets, and perhaps the bankruptcy of their owners or operators. The continuity and direction of circulating capital has to be sufficient to realize the value locked up in the fixed capital and the consumption fund. The realization of fixed capital and consumption fund values rests on the perpetuation of certain patterns of use and the ability of users to furnish a sufficient payment for that use. A new airport, for example, can only be valorized if enough flights arrive. Enough revenues can be had from provision of airport services over the lifetime of the airport, in the first instance, say, 30 years. The cost of maintenance of the machinery or the fixed capital investments, such as bridge or highway, also need to be covered. And with complex investments, such as an airport, the lifetime of parts of the whole will vary substantially. Changing the light bulbs will be frequent, but the AC and heating system will typically last much longer, and the roof even more so. The result is a continuous flow back and forth between the circulation of fixed capital and capital circulation in general. They are codependent circulations within the totality of capital, much, to go back to a familiar analogy, as liver and lungs are codependent in the human body. As in the case of facilitating the coordination between differential turnover and production times within the circulating capitals, the credit system in general, and ultimately the distinctive circulation of interest-bearing capital, emerge as useful facilitators and mediators of relations between long and medium-term fixed capital and consumption fund formation. As often happens, however, those who helpfully perform certain mediating functions, like lawyers and bankers and university administrators, can step by step emerge as organizers, managers, manipulators, and eventually dictators of those they were originally supposed to serve. Marx sees the rise of the circulation of interest-bearing capital, reflecting the need to find ways to fund long-term investments in fixed capital and in the consumption fund. For example, the mortgage market for housing and the bond market for long-term additions to the built environment, such as roads and highways, water and sewage. Contemporary credit, Marx argued, has its roots in the specific mode of realization, mode of turnover, mode of reproduction of fixed capital. With capital periodically crying out for new investment opportunities, consequent upon the massive surpluses of both capital and labor that often become dormant in times of crisis. The financialization of flows into fixed capital and consumption fund formation, lubricated by interest-bearing capital and accompanied by financial innovation, become critical for the survival of global capital. This will be the subject of the next session. Okay, I'm taking it right up to the edge of 8 o'clock. Anybody have any immediate questions? So next week, we'll get into the joys of the circulation of interest-bearing capital, which I am looking forward to because I have no idea how I'm going to work this one out, because it's a very complicated problem. But it goes back to something I was discussing earlier with Robert about, when you start to look at where the energy sources and where the power relations, which are compelling contemporary capital on its evolutionary path, we need clearly to get to the circulation of interest-bearing capital. But it is very interesting. Whenever I've looked, the rise of financialization has been just about the rise of financialization. Marx connects it, and it's an interesting link back to the circulation of interest-bearing capital to the circulation of fixed capital. So that's the rise of fixed capital, which mediates, if you like, between the general circulation of capital, circulation of fixed capital, now the circulation of interest-bearing capital, and they're all embedded in the totality. And I think it's very important you recognize that and think that through. Anything else anybody wants to? If not, we will close it down here, and wish you have a good week, and I'll put this on the web tonight or tomorrow, and we'll continue with the thing next week. And I'm really looking forward, like I say, to what I'm going to do